Sophie Wilson gripped the tray tightly as she walked across the marble floor of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurant, Le Bernardin. For 3 years, she had been planning this moment. For 3 years, she had been waiting for this day. The time had come to take revenge against Alexander Kane, the man who stole her father's company and destroyed her family. It was exactly 8:30 p.m. Alexander's table was the best corner table in the restaurant, the one he occupied every Tuesday evening. As the city lights filtered through the windows, he sat there as if the entire world belonged to him. Sophie's heart was racing, but her face showed no emotion. Like a professional waitress, she approached the table. "Good evening, Mr. Kane. Your usual order?" Alexander looked up. At 35, handsome with cold blue eyes and a perfectly tailored suit, he embodied the typical billionaire appearance. When he looked at Sophie, he paused for a moment. "Are you new here?" he asked. Sophie smiled. The fake smile she had rehearsed. "No, sir. I've been working here for 3 years. Perhaps you never noticed me before." Alexander frowned. He never noticed waitresses, but there was something different about this girl. Something familiar in her voice. "Let me get your usual order," Sophie said, placing the tray on the table. But Alexander raised his hand. "Wait. What was your name?" "Sophie Wilson, sir." Wilson. That surname reminded Alexander of something, but he couldn't figure out what. "Sophie, may I speak with you? Please, sit down." Sophie smiled inwardly. The plan was beginning to work. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't sit with customers during my working hours." "I own this restaurant," Alexander said in a cold voice, "and I'm telling you to sit." Sophie feigned a surprised expression and slowly sat down. "You know, Sophie, you seem very familiar to me." "Is that so, sir? Perhaps you know me from my previous job." "Where did you work?" A gleam appeared in Sophie's eyes. Here came the moment. "I worked at Wilson Electronics, sir. You know, that small tech company that closed 3 years ago." Alexander's face changed instantly. Wilson Electronics. Of course, David Wilson's company. That poor man's company. And this girl. "You're David Wilson's daughter," Sophie said, the fake politeness disappearing from her voice. "Sophie Wilson, daughter of David Wilson. Do you remember now?" Alexander leaned back in his chair. Now everything was falling into place. David Wilson was the owner of the small tech company that had been forced to sell to Kane Industries 3 years ago. The man had sold his company to Alexander due to financial difficulties and died shortly after from a heart attack caused by stress and grief. "Sophie, You don't need to speak, Mr. Kane," Sophie said, standing up. "I know very well how you took my father's company, how you drove him to desperation, and how he died in the end." "Sophie, the situation isn't what you think, isn't it?" Sophie's eyes were blazing. "My father trusted you. You told him you would help him. But actually, you were planning to take over his company. You stole his customers, cut his financing, and finally forced him into bankruptcy." Other customers in the restaurant began turning to look. Sophie's voice was rising. Alexander stood up. "Sophie, please calm down. Let's talk." "Talk?" Sophie let out a bitter laugh. "I wanted to talk for 3 years. For 3 years I waited for this moment. And now," Sophie reached into her bag and pulled out a thick file. "Do you know what this is? My father's private files. The files he gave me the night before he died. It contains evidence of your dirty games." Alexander's face paled. "Sophie, but I'm not here for revenge, Mr. Kane," Sophie said with a smile. "I'm here for justice." Alexander Kane had never felt so cornered in his life. How had this girl, this Sophie Wilson, gotten hold of her father's files? And more importantly, what was she planning to do with them? "Sophie, please listen to me," Alexander said, lowering his voice. What happened with your father? It's not what you think. Isn't it? Sophie placed the file on the table. Then how will you explain these photos? Photos of you having secret meetings with my father's customers. When Alexander saw those photos, his stomach churned. He had indeed held secret meetings with David Wilson's customers. But, Sophie, those meetings, were they to destroy my father? Sophie's voice sharpened. To steal his customers? No. Alexander slammed the table. Heads turned in the restaurant. I was trying to save your father. Sophie looked at Alexander with a shocked expression. What? Alexander took a deep breath. Sophie, when your father's company was failing, his only option was to sell to me. But he was going to prison because of a smuggling software case from the customs ministry. By buying the company, I saved him from that case. You're lying. No, Sophie. I tried to save your father, but the stress destroyed him. My fault was not being able to give him enough support. Sophie's hands began to tremble. This couldn't be possible. Was the revenge she had planned for 3 years built on a lie? Do you have proof? She asked in a trembling voice. Alexander took out his phone. He pressed a few buttons and handed it to Sophie. On the phone was a message David Wilson had sent to Alexander. Alexander, thank you for saving me from this case. Even though I have to sell my company to you, I know my family will be safe. You're a good man. As Sophie read the phone, her eyes filled with tears. Is this real? Sophie, I loved your father. He was my mentor. When I was fresh out of university, he gave me a job. I learned a lot from him. Sophie collapsed into her chair. Her 3 years of anger suddenly gave way to deep sadness. Her voice was trembling. You blamed the wrong person for 3 years, Alexander said gently. But I don't blame you. Losing your father must have been very difficult. Sophie began to cry. Other customers in the restaurant watched with curiosity. Alexander leaned forward and took Sophie's hand. Sophie, we need to talk, but not here. Can we meet tomorrow at noon in my office? Sophie looked up. There was genuine sadness in Alexander's eyes. Okay, Sophie said. We'll talk tomorrow. Alexander stood up, but then he did something unexpected. He pulled a small box from his pocket. Sophie, he said, raising his voice. The entire restaurant fell silent. I want to ask you something. Sophie looked at him in bewilderment. Alexander got down on one knee. Sophie Wilson, will you marry me? Chaos erupted in the restaurant. Everyone stood up, taking out their phones to start recording. Sophie was in shock. What are you doing? I'm proposing to you. But you don't know me at all. I know, but I want to marry a brave, principled woman like you. Sophie jumped up. This is ridiculous. I don't know you at all, and I reject your marriage proposal. Everyone in the restaurant held their breath. Alexander stood up and smiled. That was the answer I expected. What? Sophie, this wasn't a real marriage proposal. This was a test. Sophie Wilson stared at Alexander Kane with disbelieving eyes. A test? This man's audacity knew no bounds. A test. Sophie's voice trembled with anger. How dare you test me? Alexander raised his hands. Sophie, please listen to me. No, you listen to me. Sophie picked up the box from the table and threw it at Alexander's face. Who do you think you are? God? The restaurant was dead silent. Everyone was watching this drama with bated breath. Sophie. No, Alexander Kane. When my father died, when my mother died of cancer, when I was left completely alone, where were you people? Drinking champagne in your mansions? Alexander's face changed. Your mother died too? 6 months after my father, cancer finished her. But what really finished her was seeing the success of the man she thought caused my father's death. Namely, you. These words wounded Alexander deeply. He didn't know that David Wilson's wife had also died. Sophie, I didn't know. Of course you didn't. Because you only think about money, not people. Sophie stood up and took her bag. This ends here. I'm canceling tomorrow's appointment at your office. Alexander jumped up in panic. No, Sophie, please don't go. We have a lot to explain to you. You have nothing to explain to me. Sophie was walking toward the door. Alexander caught up with her and grabbed her arm. "Sophie, your father's death wasn't my fault. But your mother's death?" Sophie turned and looked into Alexander's eyes. "What do you mean?" "I paid for your mother's treatment costs." Sophie froze. "What?" "Your mother's cancer treatment was very expensive. Insurance wouldn't cover it. I anonymously paid for all the costs." Sophie's world was shaking. "This is impossible." Alexander took out his phone and pressed a few buttons. "Look at these hospital records. Elizabeth Wilson, Memorial Hospital. All treatment costs paid by anonymous benefactor." Sophie took the phone and read. Indeed, all her mother's treatment costs had been paid by someone. Why did you do such a thing?" "Because I loved your father, Sophie, and I felt I had to protect his family." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She had blamed the wrong person for 3 years. "But then why did I think my father died because of you?" Alexander took a deep breath. "Because someone lied to you." "Who?" "Michael Hartley, your father's former partner. He was very angry when he had to sell his shares in your company to me." Sophie remembered Michael. He was her father's closest friend. "Michael? But he was my father's best friend." "And he was also the one who told you after your father's death that I stole his customers, that I bankrupted him, wasn't he?" Sophie's face paled. Indeed, she had always heard these stories from Michael. But why would he do such a thing? "Because he's the real culprit, Sophie. Michael was the one who stole Wilson Electronics customers, who sabotaged the company. He embezzled your father's money. When I bought the company, I discovered what he had done, and the police started an investigation into Michael." Sophie's legs began to shake. "So, Michael fled to avoid going to prison, and he turned you against me so you wouldn't learn the truth." Sophie slumped into her chair. Her 3 years of anger and hatred now gave way to deep regret. I'm such a fool." Alexander leaned toward her. "You're not a fool, Sophie. You were manipulated, and I blame myself for not being able to help you." Sophie looked up. Was the marriage proposal real? Alexander smiled. "Half of it was real." "What does that mean?"
"I did it to test you, but when I saw your answer, I realized I could really fall in love with you."
Sophie blushed.
"This is ridiculous."
"Why? You're a strong, brave, principled woman. When I learned you were your father's daughter, I realized you carried his values."
"But I hated you for 3 years."
"And now you've learned the truth. Maybe we can make a new beginning?" Sophie looked at him. There was sincerity in Alexander's eyes.
I don't know."
"You don't have to rush, Sophie. I'll wait." The next morning, Sophie Wilson was thinking while drinking her coffee in her small apartment. What she learned yesterday evening had confused her mind. She had hated Alexander Kane for 3 years, and now she was learning that he had actually tried to save her family. She saw the message notification on her phone. It was from Alexander. "Good morning, Sophie. We experienced a lot yesterday evening. If you want to talk, I'm available for lunch today. We can meet at the small cafe in Evler. Just to talk, no pressure." Sophie read the message several times. The small cafe in Evler. How did he know this? This was Sophie's mother's favorite place. The phone rang. It was Alexander. "Hello?" "Sophie, this is Alexander. Did you get my message?" "Yes, I got it. But how do you know that cafe?" There was silence on the phone. Then Alexander answered. "Your mother and father used to meet there. They told me about it." Sophie's heart raced. "With my mother." "Sophie, there are other things I need to tell you. Please meet with me." Somewhere deep inside, Sophie knew Alexander had more secrets. "Okay, I'll be there at 12. At noon, when Sophie arrived at the small cafe, Alexander was already sitting there, at her mother's favorite corner table. "Hello, Sophie." Sophie sat across from him. "Alexander, did you really know my mother and father?" Alexander took a deep breath. "Yes, Sophie, I knew them very well." "How?" "Because my father was David Wilson's closest friend." Sophie was shocked. "What?" "My father, Robert Kane, David Wilson's friend from university. They founded Wilson Electronics together." Sophie's mind was confused. "But Wilson Electronics was my father's company." "Initially, there were two partners, my father and your father. But my father got cancer at an early age and transferred his shares to David. My father died when I was in university." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. So David Wilson was my father's closest friend, and you—" Alexander looked at her. "You're the daughter of my father's closest friend. This is impossible." Alexander pulled out an old photo from his pocket. In the photo were two young men. One was David Wilson. The other was...
"This is my father, Robert Kane."
Sophie looked at the photo. There really was a man very similar to her father.
Wilson Electronics was actually Wilson Kane Electronics.
Alexander said.
After my father died, David continued to use the old name.
Sophie was in amazement.
Then why didn't you ever tell me these things?
Because you hated me, and I couldn't understand why. I learned yesterday that Michael had lied to you.
Sophie put her head in her hands.
So Michael deceived both my father and you?
Yes, and now I understand that you were just trying to avenge your father.
Sophie looked up.
Alexander, I'm so ashamed. I was very unfair to you.
No, Sophie, you just loved your family. This isn't your fault.
After a moment of silence, Sophie asked,
Was last night's marriage proposal really a test?
Alexander smiled.
Half test. Half
what?
Half was real, Sophie. When I saw you, I saw your father's courage and your mother's beauty. And I asked myself, is this woman really David's daughter?
Sophie blushed.
And did I pass the test?
By rejecting my marriage proposal, you proved that you weren't interested in money or status. Just like your father, you're principled and honest. Sophie smiled. For the first time in 3 years, she was truly smiling.
So what happens now?
Alexander reached out and took her hand.
Now, maybe we can be friends. We can get to know each other slowly?
Sophie didn't pull her hand away.
Just friends?
Alexander's eyes sparkled.
If you want more.
I don't know, Alexander. This is very complicated.
Sophie, I have an offer for you.
What kind of offer?
Let's reopen Wilson Electronics. With your and my partnership. Wilson Kane Electronics, with our father's dream.
Sophie's eyes widened with surprise.
Are you serious?
Absolutely. With your engineering knowledge and my business experience combined, we can build a great company.
Sophie was thinking. This meant realizing her father's dream.
But I'm just a waitress, Alexander. I don't understand anything about the business world.
You're David Wilson's daughter. You studied engineering, and you studied your father's files for 3 years and made a perfect plan against me. You're very smart, Sophie.
Sophie began to smile.
Is this really possible?
Of course it's possible, and I want to be both your business partner and...
He paused.
And what?
And your life partner, Sophie.
Sophie's heart raced.
Alexander.
But you don't have to rush. Let's start as business partners first. Let time take us wherever it leads.
Sophie looked at him. There was genuine love in Alexander's eyes.
Okay.
Sophie said.
Let's establish.
One was David Wilson. The other was, this is my father, Robert Kane. Sophie looked at the photo. There really was a man very similar to her father. Wilson Electronics was actually Wilson Kane Electronics, Alexander said. After my father died, David continued to use the old name. Sophie was in amazement. Then why didn't you ever tell me these things? Because you hated me, and I couldn't understand why. I learned yesterday that Michael had lied to you. Sophie put her head in her hands. So Michael deceived both my father and you. Yes, and now I understand that you were just trying to avenge your father. Sophie looked up. Alexander, I'm so ashamed. I was very unfair to you. No, Sophie, you just loved your family. This isn't your fault. After a moment of silence, Sophie asked, was last night's marriage proposal really a test? Alexander smiled. Half test, half what? Half was real, Sophie. When I saw you, I saw your father's courage and your mother's beauty, and I asked myself, is this woman really David's daughter? Sophie blushed. And did I pass the test? By rejecting my marriage proposal, you proved that you weren't interested in money or status. Just like your father, you're principled and honest. Sophie smiled. For the first time in 3 years, she was truly smiling. So what happens now? Alexander reached out and took her hand. Now, maybe we can be friends? We can get to know each other slowly. Sophie didn't pull her hand away. Just friends? Alexander's eyes sparkled. If you want more. I don't know, Alexander. This is very complicated. Sophie, I have an offer for you. What kind of offer? Let's reopen Wilson Electronics with your and my partnership. Wilson Kane Electronics with our father's dream. Sophie's eyes widened with surprise. Are you serious? Absolutely. With your engineering knowledge and my business experience combined, we can build a great company. Sophie was thinking. This meant realizing her father's dream. But I'm just a waitress, Alexander. I don't understand anything about the business world. You're David Wilson's daughter. You studied engineering, and you studied your father's files for 3 years and made a perfect plan against me. You're very smart, Sophie. Sophie began to smile. Is this really possible? Of course it's possible. And I want to be both your business partner and... He paused. And what? And your life partner, Sophie. Sophie's heart raced. Alexander. But you don't have to rush. Let's start as business partners first. Let time take us wherever it leads. Sophie looked at him. There was genuine love in Alexander's eyes. Okay, Sophie said. Let's establish Wilson Kane Electronics for our father's memory. Alexander smiled and squeezed Sophie's hand. For our father's memory. 6 months later, it was the opening day of Wilson Kane Electronics. Sophie Wilson was no longer a waitress, but one of the company's founders and CTO. Together with Alexander Kane, they had realized their father's old dream. At the opening ceremony, Sophie, in a white business suit, was giving a project presentation to their company's first customers. She was no longer that old, shy waitress girl. She was a confident, brave businesswoman. Alexander watched her with pride and smiled. Sophie was truly a magnificent engineer and businesswoman. When the presentation ended, Sophie came to Alexander's side. How was it? She asked. Perfect. Your father would be very proud. Sophie smiled. Your father would be proud too. After the guests left, Sophie and Alexander were alone in the office. Sophie, Alexander said, I want to tell you something. What is it? Alexander approached and took Sophie's hands. These 6 months of working with you, getting to know you, it was the most beautiful 6 months of my life. Sophie's heart raced. Alexander, Sophie Wilson, I want to make you a real marriage proposal. Sophie's eyes sparkled. Real? Alexander pulled out a box from his pocket, but this time it was a different box. It had the letters W and K on it, Wilson and Kane. I had this box specially made, because you're special, Sophie. Alexander got down on one knee. Sophie Wilson, will you marry me? Will you spend the rest of our lives together? Will you establish the Wilson Kane family? Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of happiness. Yes, Sophie said. Yes, Alexander, I'll marry you. Alexander stood up and hugged Sophie. They kissed each other under their father's photographs, in the office where their new lives began. I love you, Sophie Wilson. I love you too, Alexander Kane. Outside, the sun was setting, but for them, a new day was dawning. The story that began with a quest for revenge was ending with love, and that old waitress girl Sophie Wilson would now become Mrs. Sophie Wilson Kane. 2 years after Sophie and Alexander's wedding, Wilson Kane Electronics had become one of the city's most successful technology companies. Sophie was now a recognized name in the tech world, and Alexander had become a more humanitarian CEO. One evening, sitting in their home garden, they held their baby in their arms. Little David Kane, their baby, who carried both grandfathers' names. "Sophie," Alexander said, "do you ever think that if you hadn't been so angry with me that night, maybe we would never have known each other?" Sophie smiled. "Sometimes the best things come in the most unexpected ways. If Michael hadn't lied to me, maybe I would never have sought you out." "True," Alexander said, kissing the baby. "And if you hadn't been so brave, if you hadn't challenged me in that restaurant, maybe I would never have noticed you." Sophie leaned against him. "Will we tell David this story when he grows up?" "Of course. We'll tell him about his grandfather's story, his mother's courage, and that love can overcome everything." At that moment the phone rang, a message from Sophie's former colleague, Maria. "Sophie, I saw you on TV. You won the Most Successful Female Entrepreneur of the Year award." "I'm so proud. By the way, guess who got out of prison?" "Michael Hartley. And now he won't talk to anyone. He must be very sorry." Sophie showed the message to Alexander. "Do you ever think about Michael?" Alexander asked. "Sometimes," Sophie said. "I'm not angry with him anymore. If he hadn't lied to me, maybe we wouldn't have met. In a strange way, I thank him." "You really are very special, Sophie Wilson Kane," Alexander said, kissing her. "And so are you, Alexander. Nobody can manage to fall in love by proposing marriage and getting rejected." They both laughed. Little David was smiling in their arms while sleeping, as if he understood his parents' story. As the stars shone in the sky, Sophie Wilson's revenge story had completely transformed into a different story, the story of true love. And that night, in that house where former enemies were now lovers, with love replacing 3 years of anger, the Wilson Kane family slept in peace. Love really does conquer all. Sometimes it just takes a little patience and the right marriage rejection. Don't forget to subscribe to Heart Chronicles channel, because in every story, love wins and justice finds its place. Share your thoughts about this story with us in the comments.